The first thing my father did when I stepped onto his lawn was laugh at me, not smile, not hug me after 3 years overseas, not ask if I had eaten or slept or survived. He laughed. The bus stops that way. He shouted across the yard while my cousins opened beers and turned to stare. I remember the heat that day. Texas heat. The kind that sticks to your skin like wet cloth and makes the air shake above the driveway. I remember the smell of burned burgers, lighter fluid, and fresh-cut grass. And I remember my mother lowering her eyes instead of stopping him. Then came a sound. Deep, violent, mechanical. The sky itself seemed to shake. Everyone looked up at once as a huge military aircraft dropped low over the neighborhood, rattling windows and sending lawn chairs sliding across the grass. My father stopped smiling, and when 2 uniformed officers stepped out and saluted me in front of everyone, my mother nearly collapsed. Part 1. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway that Sunday afternoon, my shirt was damp against my back, and the old Ford rental car smelled faintly like airport coffee and dust. I sat there for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the house I grew up in. Nothing about it had changed. Same faded white paint, same rusty basketball hoop above the garage, same wind chime my mother bought from a roadside market sometime in the 90s. Even the porch swing still creaked in the breeze the same way it used to when I was a teenager sneaking out after midnight. For a second, I almost turned the car around. I should have, but my mother had called 3 weeks earlier, her voice hesitant and careful. Your father's turning 70, she'd said. It would mean a lot if you came. What she really meant was, please try one more time. So I came. I stepped out into the heat and grabbed my duffel bag from the trunk. The bag looked worn from years of travel. Sand-colored fabric, military patches, scuffed zippers. It had been with me in places most people in that neighborhood couldn't say out loud. The backyard was crowded with relatives and neighbors. Country music drifted from a speaker somewhere near the patio. Kids chased each other through sprinklers, while men in baseball caps stood around coolers talking about football and gas prices. Nobody noticed me at first. Then my cousin Deanna looked over and froze. Well, look who finally came home. Conversation slowed. I saw the quick glances, the polite smiles, the curiosity. Not one person walked over to hug me. Then my father appeared from behind the grill, spatula in hand. Frank Carter, 6'2", broad shoulders gone softer with age, gray hair cut short like he still thought he was 35. His face had deep lines cut into it from years of sun and anger. He looked me up and down once. Jeans, boots, plain dark t-shirt, no uniform. His mouth twisted right away. Well, he said loudly, if it isn't our world traveler. A few people laughed nervously. I forced a smile. Good to see you too, Dad. He pointed the spatula toward the road behind me. The bus stops that way. Laughter broke out around the patio. Not cruel from everyone. Some uncomfortable, some automatic, but enough. I stood there holding my duffel bag while heat rose into my face. My father smirked and flipped a burger. What happened? He asked. Army finally run out of wars? I'm still serving. Hum. He nodded like he didn't believe a word. And what exactly do you do these days? Still pushing paperwork. I glanced toward my mother. Linda stood beside the picnic table arranging paper, plates nobody needed arranged. Her hands shook a little, but she didn't say anything. She never did. I work at the Pentagon now, I answered quietly. That got another laugh from my brother Jake. Oh, here we go. Jake leaned back in his lawn chair with sunglasses sitting on his head and a beer balanced on his stomach. At 38, he still somehow acted like a high school quarterback who thought life owed him applause. The Pentagon, he repeated dramatically. You hear that, Dad? Emily's basically running the country now. More laughter. I swallowed it down. That was the thing about humiliation when it comes from family. It doesn't hit sharp. It sinks slowly, like cold water filling your lungs. My father stabbed a burger too hard with a spatula. Women don't belong in combat anyway, he muttered. Never understood why you insisted on playing soldier. There it was, the same sentence, just older now. I'd heard versions of it my whole life. When I was 17 and wanted ROTC. When I enlisted after September 11th. When I graduated from officer training. When I deployed overseas. When I came home with medals, he never asked about. Nothing I ever did counted because I did it as his daughter instead of a son. Jake stayed home. Sold trucks, got divorced twice, borrowed money all the time. But Jake was solid. Jake was normal. Jake was family. I shifted my duffel higher on my shoulder and looked around the yard. My old high school friends were gone. Most neighbors were older now. One man squinted at me like he kind of remembered who I was. Nobody here knew where I'd been. They didn't know about Kandahar, or the evacuation flights, or the nights I stayed awake for 36 hours straight trying to coordinate extraction routes while mortar fire shook windows half a world away. They didn't know because they never asked. And after a while, I stopped trying to tell them. My mother finally walked over holding a glass of iced tea. You look thin, she said softly. I almost laughed at that. Not I missed you. Not I'm glad you're safe. Just thin. I'm okay, Mom. She nodded quickly and looked toward my father before stepping away again. That old familiar ache settled into my chest. Some families break loudly. Mine broke quietly over decades. I moved toward the edge of the yard near the fence, away from the noise. Cicadas screamed from the trees. Sweat ran down my spine under my shirt. Somewhere behind me, Jake started telling another joke at my expense. Then my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my pocket. ETA 90 seconds. No signature. Didn't need one. I checked my watch automatically. My father noticed. "What now?" he called. "Waiting for a taxi?" A few people laughed again. I looked at him calmly. "No, sir," I said. "My ride." He barked out a laugh. Then the sound began. At first, it was far away, low and strange, like thunder trapped underground. The conversations around the yard slowed. People turned their heads. The sound grew louder. Fast, heavy rotor blades chopping through the air with a force you didn't just hear, but felt in your ribs. Kids stopped running. Someone whispered, "What the hell is that?" Then the shadow passed over the house. Women grabbed their hats as the wind burst across the lawn. Paper plates flew through the air. Patio chairs tipped sideways. My mother grabbed the tablecloth with both hands as dust and grass spun upward around us. And coming down over my father's backyard like something from a war movie was a huge, gray bell-bowing V-22 Osprey. The aircraft hovered low enough to shake the windows. My father's face lost all color. Nobody laughed anymore. And that was the exact moment he realized the joke had never been on me. The sound of the rotors swallowed everything. Country music disappeared under the violent thunder overhead. Dust blasted across the lawn in thick waves, whipping tablecloths into the air and sending napkins spinning over the fence into the neighbor's yard. Someone screamed as a lawn chair flipped backward. One of the little kids started crying, and through all of it, I stood still. I'd heard that sound in deserts, on damaged runways, and once in the middle of a freezing evacuation zone where terrified civilians clawed at concertina wire while Marines tried to hold a perimeter together. Compared to that, my father's backyard felt strangely small. The Osprey hovered for a moment above the property before lowering onto the open stretch of grass beyond the oak tree near the back fence. The downdraft bent branches sideways and flattened the flower beds my mother had spent years tending. My father looked horrified. "Oh my God," my mother whispered. The aircraft settled heavily onto the lawn with a mechanical whine that shook the ground under our feet. Heat rolled off the engines. Dust drifted slowly through the air afterward like smoke after an explosion. Nobody moved. The neighborhood had gone silent except for the dying spin of the rotors. Half the people there looked scared. The other half looked amazed. My cousin Deanna held one hand over her mouth. Jake stared at the aircraft with his beer hanging loosely from his fingers. Across the street, neighbors were already stepping onto their driveways with phones raised. Then the rear hatch lowered. 2 officers came out. The first was a Marine colonel in dress uniform, tall and broad-shouldered, ribbons lined perfectly across his chest. The second wore Air Force blue, silver insignia shining in the afternoon sunlight. Every eye in the yard followed them as they walked straight toward me. Not toward my father, not toward the house, toward me. I could feel the tension spreading through the crowd with every step they took. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something dangerously close to fear. The Marine colonel stopped 3 feet in front of me and saluted. Sharp, immediate, respectful. "Ma'am," he said over the fading engine noise. "Apologies for the delay." The Air Force officer saluted too. My father actually stepped backward. I returned the salute calmly. "No problem, Colonel." Behind me, somebody muttered, "Jesus Christ." Jake blinked fast. "What the hell rank is she?" I heard my mother suck in a shaky breath. For a few seconds, nobody in my family seemed able to speak. Their whole understanding of me had cracked open in front of them so suddenly that they couldn't put the pieces back together fast enough. My father recovered first. "Well," he forced out with an awkward laugh, "what exactly is all this supposed to be?" The colonel looked at him briefly, clearly judging whether he mattered. Then his eyes returned to me. "We've been ordered to get you back to D.C. immediately, ma'am." My father's smile disappeared. "D.C.?" I picked up my duffel bag from beside the patio chair. "Yes." Jake finally stood. "Hold on. You mean to tell me this thing came here for you?" The Air Force officer answered before I could. "Yes, sir." Jake laughed once in disbelief. "No. No way." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. My father stared at the officers' uniforms like he was looking for proof this was all some huge prank. But military men recognize authority by instinct. Even civilians can feel it when it enters a space. And for the first time in my life, my father was realizing I had a kind of authority he couldn't laugh away. The colonel lowered his voice, slightly. "The secretary wants you back before tonight's briefing." I nodded once. "Understood." My mother grabbed the edge of the picnic table to steady herself. "Emily," her voice sounded thin. "What briefing?" I looked at her gently. "I can't talk about it, Mom." That answer shook her more than if I told her everything. Because secrets meant importance. Real importance. Not the kind my father bragged about at barbecues after too many beers. Not local politics or business deals or church committees. The kind tied to Washington, to war rooms, to decisions that crossed oceans. One of the neighborhood boys wandered closer to the fence, staring wide-eyed at the aircraft. "Is she famous?" he whispered loudly. His mother pulled him back by the arm. Noah, don't point. But several people were looking at me, differently now. Not warmly, not suddenly loving me, just carefully. As if they were realizing they had judged the quiet woman standing near the grill all wrong. Jake shook his head again and again. Dad said you work some desk job. I do, I answered. The colonel's mouth twitched slightly, like he was trying not to smile. My father caught it. His face reddened right away. What's so funny? The colonel straightened. Nothing, sir. But the damage had already been done. Because for the first time, my father understood there were conversations happening around him that he wasn't part of. He hated that feeling. You trying to embarrass us? He snapped at me suddenly. The old instinct kicked in right away. The need to make myself smaller, so he could stay comfortable. But something inside me had changed over the years. War changes your relationship with fear. After you've watched helicopters lift wounded soldiers out of active fire. After you've spent nights calling mothers whose sons aren't coming home. After you've sat in silence staring at folded flags. A backyard bully loses some power. I looked at my father calmly. You embarrassed yourself. The words hit harder than shouting would have. His jaw tightened. Around us, the neighborhood had fully gathered now. Cars slowed in the street. Phones recorded openly. My father could feel his control slipping away in real time, and it terrified him. He pointed toward the aircraft. This some kind of stunt? No. Then why the hell are they saluting you? The Marine colonel answered quietly. Because she earned it. Silence. Total silence. Even the cicadas seemed quieter. I saw my mother's eyes suddenly fill with tears. She didn't understand herself. Maybe because she was finally seeing something she should have seen years ago. Or maybe because she realized how much of my life had happened completely outside this family. My father stared at me like he was looking at a stranger wearing his daughter's face. What exactly do you do? He asked again, but this time the arrogance was gone. I held his gaze. Then I glanced toward the Osprey behind me, huge and waiting under the Texas sun. Things you said women could never do. Nobody spoke after that. The wind moved lightly through the trees. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. My mother sat slowly into a patio chair like her knees could no longer hold her up. And for the first time since I was 17 years old, my father had no comeback. People like to pretend family wounds come from one terrible moment. One slap, one betrayal, one screaming fight that changes everything overnight. But that isn't how it happened with us. My father destroyed people slowly, quietly, like water wearing down stone over years until one day there's nothing left but cracks. Even standing there beside that Osprey with half the neighborhood staring at me like I was someone important, I still felt 12 years old inside whenever Frank Carter looked at me a certain way. That was the hardest part to explain to people. Strength doesn't erase old damage. It just teaches you how to keep going while carrying it. The backyard had gone awkward after my last comment. Conversation started again in scattered pieces, low and unsure. Nobody knew what to say anymore. The barbecue smell had turned bitter from burgers left too long on the grill. My father walked to the cooler and opened another beer he didn't need. Jake stayed unusually quiet. The officers gave me space, standing near the aircraft while pretending not to notice the family tension unfolding 20 yards away. Professional courtesy. I sat at the far edge of the patio under the shade of the oak tree and watched sunlight flicker through the leaves onto the grass. For a moment, I let myself drift backward through time. Back to when all of this began. I was 8 years old the first time my father told me I laughed too loudly for a girl. 10 when he said climbing trees wasn't ladylike. 12 when he started introducing me to people as the stubborn one. Jake, meanwhile, could do almost anything and still be loved. If he got suspended from school, it was because boys are rowdy. If I argued about grades or rules or fairness, I was difficult. The rules in our house were invisible but absolute. Boys were allowed to become. Girls were expected to adjust. And my father never forgave me for refusing to shrink. The hardest fight started after September 11th. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table filling out ROTC paperwork while the television replayed smoke pouring from the towers again and again. My mother kept wringing her hands nervously. My father looked at the forms like they were a personal insult. You're not joining the military. I already did. No daughter of mine is going to war. I looked him straight in the eye for maybe the first time in my life. Then maybe your daughter isn't who you think she is. That was the beginning of the Cold War between us. At my academy graduation, families filled whole rows of bleachers holding flowers and cameras and signs. Mothers cried. Fathers shook hands proudly with officers. I searched the crowd for hours. My family never came. Later that night, Jake called me drunk from a bar. Dad says you made your choice. My choice. As if serving my country somehow meant leaving my family instead of trying to become someone inside it. The strange thing is I kept trying anyway. That's what children of difficult parents do. They chase approval long after logic says to stop. Every deployment, I mailed postcards. Every promotion, I called home. Every Christmas, I sent gifts. And every single time, the response felt transactional. Safe over there? You eating enough? You ever going to settle down? Not once did my father ask whether I was proud of myself. Not once. I spent years convincing myself it didn't matter. Then Afghanistan happened. There are things from those years I still don't talk about. Faces I still see sometimes when I wake up suddenly at 3 a.m. Certain sounds that tighten every muscle in my body before my brain even catches up. One winter night overseas, we lost 2 people during an extraction operation. I sat alone afterward in a temporary command trailer with blood on my sleeve that wasn't mine, trying to write casualty notifications while generators hummed outside in the dark. I called home 3 days later because grief does strange things to you. My mother answered. She sounded distracted. Your father's asleep. I almost hung up. Then she said softly, he worries about you more than he says. I wanted to believe her so badly. But a few months later, I flew home unexpectedly when my mother needed surgery. I arrived late at night and let myself into the house quietly because I didn't want to wake anyone. I heard my father talking in the kitchen before he knew I was there. One of his friends had stopped by. She's still in the army, the man asked. Yeah, my father said dismissively. But she's not really military material anyway. I stood frozen in the hallway holding my overnight bag. Not military material. At that point, I'd already led operations overseas, already coordinated emergency evacuations, already buried friends. But to my father, I was still just his disappointing daughter, pretending to be strong. That sentence stayed with me longer than mortar fire ever did. Back in the present, I stared out across the yard while the faraway memories faded slowly away. My mother came over carefully and sat beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The afternoon sun softened around us. The officer stayed near the aircraft, giving us privacy without making it obvious. Finally, she whispered, "You never told us any of this." I almost laughed. You never asked. The truth hurt her because it was true. She folded her hands tightly in her lap. I noticed how thin they had become with age. My mother had always looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. Your father, she hesitated. He grew up differently. So did I. Her eyes dropped. That was the tragedy of my mother. She wasn't cruel. She was compliant. And sometimes that causes just as much damage. A silence stretched between us. Then my father walked toward us from the grill. His face looked older now somehow. More fragile. What I don't understand, he said stiffly, is why you even came today. I studied him for several seconds before answering. Because the truth was humiliating. Because even after everything, part of me still wanted my father to love me openly just once before one of us died. Instead, I said, Mom invited me. He nodded once like that answer satisfied him. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded envelope. I actually came for another reason too. My father frowned. What's that? I handed him the envelope. Inside were mortgage papers paid in full. His forehead creased deeper as he read. What is this? The house, I said quietly. It's been paid off for almost 4 years. My mother's breath caught sharply. My father looked up slowly. You did this. I nodded. Silence spread between us again, heavier this time. Why? He asked. That single word carried real confusion. Not gratitude, confusion, and somehow that hurt more. I looked at the house behind him, the peeling paint, the old porch swing, the windows glowing gold in the late afternoon sun. Then I looked back at the man who spent my whole life holding back approval like it was money. Because I kept hoping, I said softly, that one day you'd finally see me as your daughter. My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The strange thing about pride is that it rarely falls apart all at once. Men like my father don't suddenly become humble because the truth embarrasses them. Usually they fight harder. They reach for anger because anger feels stronger than shame. I saw that happening inside him the moment he handed the mortgage papers back to me. His fingers shook a little, though he tried to hide it. Around us, the barbecue had completely lost its rhythm. Conversations drifted in pieces. People pretended not to stare while absolutely staring. My cousins whispered near the patio table. Across the street, neighbors stayed by their mailboxes much longer than needed. My father hated public vulnerability more than anything. And now he was standing in the middle of his own lawn, feeling exposed in front of everyone he'd spent years trying to impress. You shouldn't have done this, he muttered. The mortgage, all of it. I studied him quietly. Why? Because now people think I couldn't provide for my own family. There it was. Not concern about me spending that money, not emotion over what the gesture meant, just ego. My mother closed her eyes briefly like she was tired down to her bones. Jake suddenly stood from his chair. Dad, maybe just stop talking. My father whipped around immediately. Stay out of this. No. Jake snapped, surprising everyone. Seriously, just stop. That caught my attention. Jake and I had never been close, but seeing him challenge our father even a little felt almost unreal. My father stared at him. You taking her side now? Jake rubbed one hand over his face. There aren't sides anymore. The words settled heavily over the yard. Because he was right. This wasn't a family argument anymore. It was a collision between truth and denial was losing badly. The Marine colonel approached carefully then, sensing the shift in the air. Ma'am, he said quietly to me, we'll need wheels up in approximately 15 minutes. Understood. My father looked between us. 15 minutes for what? I didn't answer right away. The colonel did. There's a meeting at the Pentagon tonight regarding military family extraction operations. My father frowned. Extraction? The officer gave a small nod. Yes, sir. Jake let out a low whistle under his breath. My father looked back at me slowly. You're involved in that? Yes. How involved? I hesitated. Not because the answer was fully classified. Parts of it were, parts weren't. But because this was the first time in my life my father had ever asked about my work with real attention. And somehow that hurt worse than if he had kept mocking me. I oversee several international coordination teams, I said carefully. Mostly evacuations involving military families and diplomatic personnel. My mother stared at me in disbelief. You mean when people get trapped overseas? I help get them home. Silence. The kind that changes shape inside people. I watched my father trying to match the daughter he thought he knew with the woman standing in front of him now. You could almost see the years rearranging themselves painfully behind his eyes. Suddenly, he looked tired. Not old exactly, just weighed down by realization. You never told us any of this. That sentence almost made me angry enough to laugh. I tried. His forehead tightened. No, I said calmly. I did. You just weren't listening. A memory rose instantly between us both. Christmas dinner 7 years earlier. I'd mentioned getting a commendation after an overseas operation. My father interrupted halfway, through to complain about football players kneeling during the national anthem. Another memory. The time I called after a deployment extension, and he spent 20 minutes talking about Jake's truck sales without asking how I was doing. Another. My father remembered them too. I could tell. Regret started showing in his face now in small, uncontrollable flashes. That was the thing about truth. Once it enters a room, it becomes hard to force it back out. Jake looked toward the Osprey. So all this time, he shook his head slowly. You were actually doing something huge. I almost smiled at the wording. Actually, as if my life only became real once men in uniform proved it in public. But I understood where he came from. Our father trained us both to measure worth by his approval system. Jake just happened to fit the mold better. I wasn't hiding, I said quietly. You all just decided who I was years ago. Nobody argued with that. My mother suddenly stood and wrapped her arms tightly around herself against a breeze that barely existed. I should have defended you more. Her voice cracked on the last word. I looked at her for a long moment. Maybe 10 years earlier. Hearing that apology would have broken me emotionally. Maybe I would have cried. Maybe I would have poured out decades of hurt. But grief changes shape with time. Eventually, it stops screaming and just sits quietly beside you. I know, I said softly. Tears filled her eyes at once. My father looked away toward the street, where neighbors still pretended not to watch. One of them, old Mr. Hanley from 3 houses down, finally walked closer through the side gate. He looked at me first, then at my father. You should be proud of her, Frank. Simple sentence. Ordinary sentence. But it landed harder than anything else that afternoon because it came from another man. Another older man from the same generation, same town, same worldview. And suddenly my father had nowhere left to hide his excuses. Mr. Hanley nodded respectfully toward me before walking away again. My father stared down at the grass for several seconds. Then, quietly, almost offensively, he muttered, I just wanted her to have a normal life. I answered before anyone else could. No, you wanted me to have a smaller one. His head lifted sharply. I stood slowly from the patio chair and stepped closer to him. The yard had gone silent again. Even the officers stopped moving. You spent my whole life teaching me that I would never matter unless a man approved of me, I said calmly. First you, then someday a husband. My father opened his mouth. I kept going anyway. You mocked everything that made me strong because it didn't fit the version of a daughter you wanted. His face tightened painfully now. And the worst part, I swallowed once. I spent years believing you. That finally broke something in him. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet collapse behind the eyes. The realization that while he had been trying to force me into obedience, the world had shaped me into someone far beyond his understanding. The colonel checked his watch quietly. Time. I picked up my duffel bag again. My mother's breathing turned uneven right away. You're leaving now? Yes. Something desperate flashed across her face. Emily, please. Her voice shook. Please don't disappear again. I paused. The wind moved softly across the torn-up lawn. Rotor blades clicked quietly as they cooled behind us. My mother looked terrified suddenly. Not of the aircraft, not of my career, but of losing the chance to know me before it was too late. I stood there for one long heartbeat with my back partly turned toward her. But I didn't answer, and I didn't look back. For a moment, nobody moved. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the torn-up lawn, while the Osprey rested behind us like some enormous gray animal waiting to carry me away again. Dust still clung to the flower beds. One of my mother's wind chimes swayed weakly near the porch, making soft, hollow sounds in the silence. I tightened my grip on the duffel bag and started toward the aircraft. Then I heard my mother crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quiet. tired crying from the kind of woman who spent most of her life swallowing her own feelings before they became inconvenient for someone else. I stopped walking. Behind me, I heard her footsteps hurrying over the grass. Emily! Her voice broke completely this time. I turned slowly. My mother stood there with tears running down both cheeks, one hand pressed against her chest like she couldn't catch a full breath. Up close, I could suddenly see how much older she'd become. The tiny lines around her eyes, the shaking in her hands, the tiredness that seemed sewn into her posture itself. For years, I'd been so angry at her silence that I forgot silence can come from fear too. Not always weakness. Sometimes survival. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they fixed anything, they didn't, but because they were real. No excuses. No defending my father. No pretending everything had been misunderstood. Just sorrow. "I should have protected you," she said shakily. "I knew he was hard on you. I knew it hurt you." Her voice broke again, and I kept telling myself staying quiet kept the peace. I looked away briefly toward the fading sunlight beyond the trees. There were so many years inside me, so many birthdays missed, so many phone calls that ended with me staring silently at hotel ceilings overseas, wondering why I still kept trying. I thought forgiveness would feel bigger when it finally came. But really, it felt quiet, like setting down something heavy after carrying it too long. "I used to think you didn't love me," I admitted softly. My mother covered her mouth immediately, as if the sentence physically hurt her. "Oh God, I know now that you did," I continued. "You just didn't know how to stand up to him." Tears rolled faster down her face. For the first time since I'd arrived, I stepped forward and hugged her. She broke instantly. I felt her arms tighten around me with desperate strength. And suddenly, she was sobbing against my shoulder like someone grieving years she could never get back. "I was always proud of you," she whispered through tears. Even when I didn't say it. My eyes burned unexpectedly. I held her tighter for a second before gently pulling back. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, Mom. I know, but I don't want to keep carrying it anymore." She nodded weakly. Behind her, my father still stood near the patio alone now. Jake had moved away toward the driveway, giving him space. The neighbors had mostly gone back inside their homes, though curtains still shifted now and then. Even from a distance, my father looked smaller somehow. Not physically, spiritually. Like life had finally forced him to face himself without distraction. I walked toward him slowly. Every step felt strangely calm. No anger left, no need to win. That surprised me most of all. My father watched me come closer with the uncertain look of a man who had spent decades believing authority naturally belonged to him and suddenly realized he no longer understood the room around him. When I stopped in front of him, neither of us spoke right away. Then he cleared his throat. "You really paid off the house." "Yes. Why didn't you tell us?" I gave a faint, tired smile. Would it have mattered? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That silence answered the question better than words could. The breeze shifted lightly through the trees overhead. Somewhere far away, a dog barked. The world kept moving despite everything that had just happened between us. Finally, my father looked straight at me, and for the first time in my whole life, he looked uncertain. "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly. I studied him carefully. "No," I answered. "You were protecting your idea of what a daughter should be." His eyes lowered. A long silence stretched between us. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he said, "I was wrong about you." That was it. No dramatic speech, no tears, no sudden change into a perfect father. Just 4 words pulled painfully out of a proud old man who had spent 70 years believing apologies made people weak. And somehow that made the matter more. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't even realized was still there. Not complete healing. Maybe that doesn't exist. But something close to peace. The colonel approached one final time. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. "We need to depart." I nodded once. Then I held out my hand toward my father. For half a second, he stared at it awkwardly. Then he ignored the handshake completely and pulled me into a rough, unfamiliar hug. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, 3 at most. But I cannot explain to you what it feels like to spend your whole life emotionally starving and finally receive even the smallest piece of what you needed when you no longer expect it. When he stepped back, his eyes were wet, though he'd rather die than admit it. I picked up my duffel bag one last time and turned toward the Osprey. The 2 officers straightened right away as I walked toward them. Then both men saluted sharply. This time, before I could return it, the saluting movement caught my eye. My father. Slowly, awkwardly, he straightened his shoulders too. His hand rose uncertainly toward his forehead. The salute wasn't military perfect, not even close. His fingers shook, but it was real. And for the first time in my life, my father wasn't saluting rank. He was saluting me. I returned all 3 salutes together. Then I boarded the aircraft. The hatch began to close as the engines roared louder again, shaking the grass and trees under the darkening Texas sky. Through the narrowing opening, I saw my mother holding onto my father's arm while he stood motionless in the middle of the destroyed lawn, staring up at me. Not ashamed anymore, not angry, just overwhelmed by the realization that the daughter he underestimated had become someone extraordinary while he wasn't paying attention. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, the neighborhood grew smaller below us. And for the first time in my life, my father finally saw me before I was gone. If this story touched you in any way, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts below. Sometimes the deepest wounds in life come from the people closest to us. And sometimes healing comes when we least expect it. Share where you're watching from, and let me know if you've ever had to prove your worth to someone who underestimated you. We have many more emotional stories like this waiting for you. So please subscribe and stay for the next journey.